Hello. I always have to like psych myself up and then remember what it is.
Just let it
I love
rip.
the,
Just be
I love
like,
this.
hey guys. It's
I
Yeah,
love
like,
the smile before you started talking, like
yeah.
you were
it's
heating up for it.
yeah.
Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello and welcome to the Pros and Cons podcast, where sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. Today we're going to be chatting about governmental oppression, loss of identity, technological control, mass poverty, and suffering. No, the Pros and Cons podcast has not gone political. We're not discussing current events. Today we are discussing dystopian stories and dystopian novels, which are stories that imagine a future in which humanity and society has become unbearable, unbearable dehumanized struggle, often as a result of some kind of governmental oppression or control. Pretty bleak stuff, but despite being such a dark premise, these stories continue to be very popular. So we're going to try to delve into that and figure out why is that? Why do people like reading dystopian stories? And why should you be reading dystopian stories, or why should you be writing dystopian stories? So today I'm joined by Phoenix Reg.
Hello. Good to be back. Yeah, I'm Phoenix, and if anyone's forgotten or this is the first time, I'm the founder of Bent Light Writing. It's an freelance editing house that puts a focus on authenticity reading, award-nominated author, children's author, all that good stuff.
Nice. And Matan.
Hi, my name is Matan. I'm also a writer. I write fantasy and horror, and I teach English during the daytime.
And at nighttime,
Yeah, don't ask about the nighttime.
And I am your host, James Healy. I write short stories and I'm working on a novel. So, yeah, I wanted to ask you guys, what are some dystopian stories that you've read, and which ones did you enjoy and what did you enjoy about them?
you want to go first,
Hmm.
Matan? I feel like I need a moment on this one.
Yeah, no, no worries. Well, I think first, first I'd like to say why I like dystopian stories. And the reason I like them is because a lot of time when we're writing a novel, we're thinking about in terms of protagonist, goal, and obstacle. If we boil it down to the simplest terms, we have a hero. The hero wants something, and something gets in his way. But a lot of the times when you take a dystopian story, the want becomes a bit blurrier because suddenly it can almost feel like the settings themselves, the environment itself is antagonistic. And perhaps the goal is to alter the environment itself, unless you're reading a tragic dystopian story, in which case you're just along for the ride and seeing how the guy tries to make a life out of it. I'm going to mention one that I mentioned in a recent podcast, which is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro,
Oh my
which is
gosh.
yeah, it's
Yep.
we mentioned it in the Ones That Blew Our Mind podcast. And spoiler alert, I'm gonna have to go into spoiler territory to explain why that book is a dystopian story. So if you're meaning to read it, please skip the next few minutes. But in Never Let Me Go, we are from the point of view of a bunch of British teenagers in a boarding school. We slowly learn that they are actually clones bred for their organs. And starting at a relatively young age, their organs are harvested until they can no longer survive without the organs that have been taken away. Uh, Leaves a lot of room for imagination. You don't know exactly which organs are taken. You can only imagine. Um, the point is that this is an example for a dystopia in which the protagonist doesn't really have a chance to change the environment. So if we look at the environment as the antagonist, the heroine does not really try to put an end to it. She does not lead a rebellion of clones against this dark and twisted fate, but instead we get a more grounded story. She does have the hope throughout the story that if she can prove that she truly fell in love, then she will be spared. But even that is just really a pipe dream. No one really blatantly says that to her. And we as readers are kind of left with that twisted feeling in our stomach. like, okay, this dystopia is too insurmountable to change. She doesn't even think about changing her fate as much as she's trying to make a life in this twisted environment. Another example of a dystopia, and I'm going to go all the way to the other direction, is fantasy, actually. I'm going to go with the Mistborn trilogy, the Final Empire specifically, in which, again, we have a dystopia. We have a final godlike ruler. He calls himself Lord Ruler. He's like this Sauron figure who's impossible to defeat. And the dystopian elements are basically rampant racism, dictatorship, the worst stuff you can imagine. But clearly the heroes are willing to rise up against it. And then you have the dystopia, much like in the Hunger Games, by the way, which the characters try to topple, to change. So you have two very different ways to tackle the dystopian story. Either the insurmountable, look, we're not going to save the world. Let's try to have, something for ourselves. And you have the dystopia in which you get to see characters try to undo the damage or bring it closer to a better reality. So these are two stories that I personally enjoyed.
When I found out we were going to be talking about dystopia today, I realized I haven't read like any dystopian fiction. I don't think I've I was thinking up until this morning, and nothing popped in my head of like I think there may have been, but it was so long ago and not really there, or so subtle that I wouldn't really count it. But I have some examples of things I've watched and stuff, one of which is the movie adaptation of Never Let Me Go, which I also thought, very much so dystopian, but very, it's like very integrated dystopian. And it was actually, I would say it's dystopian way more believable dystopian in the sense that it's way closer to the dystopia of our own society, in the sense that for all intents and purposes, that society looks like it's thriving, but we're focusing on a marginalized group in that society where it is very much so a dystopian. They're suffering. Thinking about dystopia in general was a really cool exercise because I started to think about why I wouldn't consider certain things dystopian. And for example, per your suggestion, James, I just went on a very fun Dan Simmons ride for the last number of months. I just finished reading Hyperion, and I just finished listening to The Terror.
Oh, nice.
And, yeah. But I was thinking about The Terror, and I'm like, well, they're like living in a what's that one?
I'm trying to show the camera my copy of Hyperion without a lot of success, but I have
nice.
Nice.
Haven't
I've
read
gotten
it.
everyone onto the Dan Simmons train.
That's our
he's dragged us all into it.
That's the next precipice unofficial book club book. Yeah. We do have these little waves of unofficial book club moments. Like it was Moby Dick first, and
Wolf Hall. I think that was like half the precipice fiction.
Yes, that's the other one.
So now everyone's read Hyperion except for Ali. Ali's the next one I'll work on next.
True. Wow. But I was thinking about The Terror, and it's definitely not a dystopian. And I was like, well, that's interesting because they are living in a little microcosm of dystopia, or like little microcosm of dysfunction, or whatever you want to call it. I was like, why wouldn't I consider it a dystopian book? And it's because it is like I feel like a key element of dystopia is that the antagonist is society, and it needs to be grander, greater society. It can't be a microcosm. It also kind of needs to be faceless. The Terror is not like, and I guess while you were talking, Matan, it almost now feels like dystopian society or dystopian books they almost feel like the modern like epic, like if you think of like Roman or like old literature epics where you have these heroes that go into battle and do these things. I feel like now we really, as a society, really glorify individuals who can rise above societal oppression and take their power back from society, because it's something we really relate to, and it's like we really glorify that individual.
Or die trying.
Yeah. But I'll just list some, I don't know, some things I watched. Oh, I did read 1984, but it was so long ago and I didn't finish it. And it was more of like a for school book. But
Okay.
I can comment on it. I remember feeling very different inside while I read that book as a younger person. I watched Arcane, a great show on Netflix. And that one's, I feel, a very distilled version of a dystopian society. You literally have the city cut in half and it's just like, here's what's not working. But very well done and very good. The Matrix, obviously, Never Let Me Go, Hunger Games, and Metropolis by our very own Ali Burnham
Mhm.
is a dystopian society,
Oh
very
yeah.
akin to, or yeah, has some Big Brother elements and stuff like that.
I just feel like I don't want to be depressing, but Phoenix touched on something very, very true, I think, that he said if you zoomed into specific situations happening in the world today, you would have a dystopian story. You do not
Hmm.
have to go to 1984. You do not have to go to Never Let Me Go or Hunger Games. You could literally highlight an area in the world from a specific point of view, usually, that is dystopian. And for them, it is dystopian. It could be inequality. It can be literal hunger compared to people eating well just over the fence.
Yeah,
And I think that follows on what James asked, which is why should you write dystopian fiction? Beyond the obvious elements that Phoenix highlighted, it is kind of the modern epic in a way that, the rise against the machine, the the character against society. It is exciting. But then again, why should we write dystopian fiction? And why do you guys think people started writing dystopian fiction in the first place?
Well, one thing that I think something that I think people really like about dystopian stories is that they can kind of serve as a parallel or as an allegory to the here and now, either in taking a representation of, like you were saying, maybe something which is happening in a microcosm, um, and maybe kind of honing in on that, or by taking some idea or some aspect of society today and then kind of like turning it up to 11 and saying like what would happen if that became like the main thing that we were doing all the time.
hmm
I think a lot of stories they can kind of be structured around that kind of sense. I think that's a big reason why people probably started uh, writing them. And then another element of I think kind of overall the stories tend to be, even though like they're really depressing, which I think is like that's probably my favorite thing about them. I said my two favorite stories are like 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale. Particularly
Oh
The
God.
Handmaid's Tale, that is the story of like a society which is actually functioning despite the obstacles that have been thrown at them. But we're seeing that society from the perspective of the person who's in like the worst position in that society. And so because of that, it's absolutely harrowing. And it's like you can't possibly like, justify having a society that way. Um, but I think that's an element of like good, like the fact that it's depressing. I think that's an element of like good art. Good art should kind of make you feel, make you empathize, make you a bit disturbed. But despite being so depressing, dystopian stories are often about like kind of triumph over the circumstances and kind of like the triumph of the human will and the human spirit to kind of persevere and often like rebel and change those societies. And sometimes, like you said, the odds are insurmountable and they aren't able to. But I think it's about the characters kind of living through these things and still having that fire in them to try and change things and make things better. And I think that turns into the other element of something that readers really enjoy, which is like, what would you do if you were in that situation? What would you do if you were living in that society, or what would you make of it and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that's an important element of these kind of stories. Of what would you do? Would you stand up and fight? Would you just, keep your head down? I think that in part is what would make us think about a book long after we closed it. Is these kind of thoughts. I've recently read a really, really short story for university called You Are Now Entering the Human Heart. I will find the author in a
Whoa.
moment. But it's basically a story of a woman who enters a museum And as she's entering the museum, this guy is giving a tour to a class of elementary school children and their elderly teacher. As part of the class, he wants to show them that a snake is not dangerous. So without really asking the elderly teacher, he kind of puts a snake around her neck and then sort of berates her as she starts to be afraid, like saying things like adults shouldn't be afraid of snakes. She's not afraid. All while the teacher is having this very evident mental breakdown in front of the children that she's basically their teacher. And finally, she kind of throws the snake off of her and runs to a chair and kind of breaks down mentally. Look, this is a pretty grounded story, right? It's a snake on a woman. She freaks out. It doesn't take global upheaval to show that something is wrong. But walking out of that story, I was asking myself if I had seen something like that occur, where it's obvious that there's no consent here. She did not agree to have the snake just put on her neck. She's obviously uncomfortable. She's whatever you want to call it. Would I have done anything? And the thing is that the narrator just kind of stands there and watch. So it's not like she's walking past and didn't pay attention. It's a very close first-person point of view. If we know that the woman is horrified, it's because the narrator knows that the woman is horrified. And following what James said, it just kind of makes you think, like, what would I have done? And in a way, doesn't that kind of teach us a lesson? Doesn't that kind of prepare us for moments in the future, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. Rather than having that experience where you afterwards you wish you had done something, reading about it and saying, I wish if I'd been there, or you have that regret in a situation that isn't a real feeling or a real situation, more like. So yeah, definitely, I think it is an example of preparing you for that.
Just to clarify, the story I just described was by a woman named Janet Frame, and really interesting story. Janet Frame was hospitalized for mental health somewhere in the 50s. They were about to lobotomize her.
Holy shit!
And then her stories won an award. And they said, "Oh, we cannot lobotomize an award-winning author."
Oh my gosh!
And that's why her lobotomy was canceled. So people keep writing. You never know; it might save your life.
Far out.
Well,
I'm glad she didn't get lobotomized.
Absolutely, Jesus.
I think I like drawing the parallel to sci-fi with dystopian, and not just because it's like they're kind of vaguely both futuristic. But I like how, and actually, this is not a plug. Well, this is an organic.
It is a plug, and that's okay.
This organically came up, but I wrote about this very thing in the story that I wrote for New Mythic. Like, this is very much so a big part of what that story was about, is like training, like, image recognition and training a society towards your image or your idea of the future. And sci-fi writers have very much so influenced the direction of where we've taken society. A lot of our technology is inspired by what was once very imaginable. And we thought, like, oh, we could do that. And, we get this, it's an idea that gets into the head of the zeitgeist and the population. And then we fix our gaze on that and we go towards it. And I feel like dystopian literature has the same effect, but in kind of in kind of the reverse way, where it almost shows us what to avoid in a way. Like, people put these ideas out there and it brings the attention to it, and suddenly, everyone's very aware of certain things. And at the very least, it eliminates things that the government in our world could do, because they're like, oh, people are way too touchy to that. So at the very least, we'll have to call it something else, or to change the shape of it a little bit. But
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, but it raises awareness and I'll get away from the word trains. I think of it in a very machine learning sort of way. So training sounds bad, but it is just like, adapting, learning. But it helps raise awareness in sort of a anti-idyllic way, where you're putting out very large extremes and are having a population explore them and consider them, and then ultimately the zeitgeist is affected.
I like what you said, Phoenix, but how do you do it in a way that is not too on the nose? That it's because I guess the joy is as a reader feeling like you figured it out, like the allegory, rather than the
Mm,
allegory being stuffed down your throat, if that makes sense.
mm.
So how do you make it subtle that you are actually talking about 21st century media? That makes sense. Or whatever thing you are basically pushing to the edge.
Oh, like if you were trying to actually highlight or like expand on an
Yeah,
element of our present society.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, I would, okay, this is like right off the top of the head. I've never thought about this ever. I've never even
Let's
written dystopian
let's
society. The
go.
first thing that comes to my mind is I would focus on characters very much so, because
Mm.
if otherwise it becomes very didactic very fast. But build the characters, focus on the people, the human conditions.
Which is what never that's what Never Let Me Go does. It focuses on the people, on their
Mm.
friendships, on their romance, like
Hmm.
who kissed who, and in the background, people are being harvested. Their lungs are being taken out of them. Um, yeah, that's I think that's a good strategy.
Yeah, and I think something that's worth remembering is that if it is a story which has like an allegory with today's society, um, at whatever point in the story, like the penny drops, I guess. So at any point in the story, it's become obvious that this is about something which is occurring. There's going to be people that agree with that premise and people that don't agree with that premise. And people who agree with the premise are going to love the story. And
Hmm.
people who don't agree with the premise, they may just not connect that it's about today's society because that may not be how they view today's society. Um, or they might be aware that there are people who view today's society in that way and they don't view that society. So they might just kind of reject the premise. And
Yeah.
so it does kind of come down to, that does kind of come down to your audience as well. In the same way that if you're writing a romance novel and the characters fell in love a certain way, there would be people who see that as authentic and there would be people who don't see that as authentic. So there is a certain amount of audience interpretation playing out as well.
One that I just thought of, and this is like this really blurs the line because it is just a commentary on modern society, but a fairly recent Netflix movie, Don't Look Up, is very
Oh,
like it highlights the dystopian elements of our own society and the sort of spinning wheels of the public machine or the not political machine.
Yeah.
James, didn't we rank that in our failure podcast?
Don't Look Up.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we Phoenix, we did a failures podcast where we ranked failures in fiction,
Hmm.
Oh
from
wow.
from really bad to really good. Like S tier was, I think, Thanos killing everybody, and William Wallace failing to thwart English rule over Scotland. I think, yeah,
Oh,
James, you put that.
it was characters' failures, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So one
Yeah,
of
yeah.
them was the people
That's
in
fun.
Never Look Up, basically failing to save the Earth from the
Mm,
asteroid.
yeah.
I think they got a C. I think we gave that a C. But yeah, that's a good example for a very close to
Very close.
reality.
Yeah, very
But
close
did
to
you
the
find it
best.
to be? But did you find it to be subtle, Phoenix?
No, that one was
No.
one where
Yeah.
the appeal the main drive of that one was we're gonna be right on the nose. Like we're not trying to be subtle was
No,
their mantra.
they were they were not subtle at all.
Yeah.
Did it still work for you?
Yeah, I that one was it was better for it. But they did a very good job of taking a very like raw basic thing and kind of fed it into the modern society machine to kind of give that example of what would happen. Like, like
Yeah,
we're used, yeah, taking a giant meteor hurtling towards Earth
pretty basic.
and pretty basic
Yeah.
extinction on a massive level. It's very primal, it's very
Yeah,
catastrophic. So I mean, you have that hook. They did a good job of hooking, and then it's they have the element of the bizarre on their hands as well as the familiar because it's like you have this crazy situation where it's that's where the dystopian elements are highlighted. People's reactions to this, like this thing that it subverts your expectation of like not even so much your expectation of like how it would be handled, but more so your expectation of like when you imagine that situation happening, um, you imagine being able to raise sirens and red flags very quickly. But then once you imagine yourself going through the system that is put in place, it becomes like, oh, whoa. And it becomes this very bizarre juxtaposition that's very wild to watch. So
My
yeah, it
favorite
works.
moment is where they're almost about to blow up the asteroid, and then someone convinces them that there's actually more money to be made from
Oh,
not blowing up the asteroid.
Yeah.
And they're like, but think about the people making jobs, think about the economy. And it's like, dude, there's literally an asteroid coming to blow us up. I just, and yeah, it is very on the nose. Maybe sometimes there is a time to be on the nose, I suppose.
Not to change the subject, but there's one other element of kind of the dystopian stories that I just want to touch on. So they usually tend to be stories of kind of like downward control and downward oppression from some kind of dictator or powerful government. But something that can make them feel very real and very authentic is if the writer has a balance of the dystopia, but also like the utopia, because there's almost always people living in this society that have everything, or they at very least have like a lot more than we would have in like modern society. So there's often a class divide, but there is almost kind of like just two worlds that people are living in within this dystopia, where people they might be experiencing like a society where there's peace and everything is provided for, and there's great healthcare and great education. But that comes at the cost of some other group of people who are like paying the price for all of this existing. So if someone's telling a story, they can set it in the utopia and then gradually reveal the dystopia, or they can set it in the dystopia and then kind of you get glimpses of the utopia and you see like this is why the society exists this way. I think that balances out a dystopian story really well and makes it, rather than making it just be, these people are suffering just because they're suffering, if you know what I mean. I think a lot of, I know a lot of people try to write dystopian stories just because they want to write about the bleak side of it. And it just becomes like I don't know what like a suffered train of just terrible things happening. But there's usually in like the really good stories, there's usually a point or usually a reason for why this society is structured that way, which I think really fleshes out a dystopian setting.
I feel like part of the reason why that works is because it does very much so mirror the divide of our own society, where we do recognize that there are people that, whole countries that are on the tail end of a very linear sort of top-down flow of resources and stuff. And so it does call to a sense of familiarity, and then it just makes it a bit more black and white, a bit more easy to see. And I don't know, when it's easier to see, it's gonna call your attention more.
I think I really liked what you said, James, about the direction of the discovery. Are we starting like in The Giver, where we have this perfect world and slowly things are unearthed to show how it's messed up? Or in The Hunger Games, where we start in the poor districts and then we kind of discover that some people live large? I agree. You can take it in multiple directions. Something I like to see a bit more, and I think that's an interesting direction to mine, is the character who benefits from the utopia. How do we approach that character? How much compassion do we have for the non-involved person who clearly benefits, who clearly enjoys the fruits of the dysfunction? And what can we do with those kind of characters in terms of character arc? Are they willing to risk it or not? I think that's something I enjoy in a good dystopia story, where it's not just black and white, bad people, good people, rich people, poor people, but also people on both sides. You got people, and the system is allowed to be really the antagonist, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought they did a really good job of that in The Handmaid's Tale, because there was kind of the obvious, the men that made the patriarchy and they were in charge. It was obvious like what they were getting out of it, but they also had the wife that lived in the house, and they gave her certainly in the series they gave her quite a complex character where I can't remember exactly the details, but like she kind of wanted the family and she wanted a child, I think. So it was giving an example of how she was benefiting from this world, but then she was also I think because certainly in the series, at least, she was a very kind of outspoken feminist, and she was like advocating for women. So they gave her quite a conflicted character in the same way. And I know in the series, I forget if it was in the book, but I know in the series there was another handmaid who had lived a really bad life prior to everything happening, and she was now living quite comfortably. And she felt that the price that she was paying for living quite comfortably was worth it. And I think both of those characters went a long way towards showing how complicity can be an element of oppression as well, and how you give give people just enough so that they do go along with a system, and that makes the system all the more difficult to like fight against.
When you widen, the more you widen the pool of people benefiting from a dystopia, the more stable it is. If you have a very narrow pyramid with one or a very small percentage of society at the top, there's more danger because the foundation that it basically sucks everything from is wider. But when you have something closer to a 50-50, or in some cases maybe 70-30, like there's a smaller section of the population. Let's look at slavery, for example. Slaves, again, I'm going to try not to be political here, but slaves have been a minority, and that made it easier to do what was done to them. If you look at another country where they were the majority, then suddenly it's a bit harder to maintain that thing.
I think we just need to say it's impossible to talk about dystopia without getting political.
Yeah.
It's inherently political.
Yeah.
It's a commentary on political systems and the downfalls, the things to watch out for in the given systems. I'm honestly having a really hard time with like every example we're giving. It just echoes something that's just part of regular conversation, and that's the part of it. That's not like what is it called? Dooming or whatever. Is that what the kids are saying these days? Dooming. But like where it's like, it's not doom and gloom, like, oh, we're becoming this dystopian. But dystopian literature has always been a commentary on dystopian aspects of society that are present in different levels at different times. So it's not like a transition and we're heading towards dystopia and where once it was paradise and now it's dystopian or anything like that. It's just as we progress, politics and larger societal dynamics are almost like an organic beast of their own that do govern in weird ways. And it's something that's really interesting to look at. I mean, people dedicate their lives to studying this stuff, and some of them, I'm sure, write dystopian literature because it is just a way of exploring certain political practices and concepts and stuff. But like, yeah, you have the 1%, and you wouldn't want it to be 1%, 99%, but a trickle down 1% where you gradually go down.
And again, if you're writing a dystopia, you basically have to consider the power balance. If you are writing about a 1 or 2 or 5% dystopia, you need to justify it mechanically in your story. If you write in fantasy, maybe it's a little easier. You just give them the ability to shoot lightning bolts. But if you're writing something a bit more grounded, you're gonna have to justify. Well, why don't the 50 million do something about the 20,000? Yeah. You'll have to come up with good reasons that satisfy your reader as to what is keeping this dystopia alive, because human nature is not to want to live like the Handmaid's Tale or the Hunger Games. There needs to be something keeping them down. But I find it harder to humanize the oppressor the smaller their slice of the population is. When it's really 2% benefiting or 10% benefiting from inhumane conditions for the 90%, it's very hard to get behind it as a reader. Very, very hard to see them as innocently complicit, if that's a thing, or like unaware.
Example that comes to mind is V for Vendetta. Like, freaking love that movie, by the way. That's an incredible watch. But the sort of face of the oppression is almost like, I mean, he's complicit, but he's more he's not innocent, he's ignorant. Like when it's like you realize, and I think 1984 does this as well. Actually, I'm not sure if it does. I can't remember, but it does. It's kind of a rug out from under you sort of moment, because this face that you've associated with the oppression the whole time, your focal point, when you finally like sort of reach that person, like that, you get to that person, you realize they're a coward, and they aren't the power. They're just an ignorant piece of it. And suddenly that's kind of the reveal of the true antagonist, which is the society itself, and the constructs that have been, the foundations that have been laid in place that are now almost governing themselves. And this is just a human being that's been put in this position of power that's like pathetic, and like,
Exactly.
they don't have any power.
That was a very good example, V for Vendetta. I think when you write your antagonist for your dystopia, you can choose. Am I picking a low-level enforcer of the dystopia, who's got his own problems at home, and he's just kind of enforcing the dystopia because it puts him a rung above starvation or whatever? Or am I writing the mouthpiece, like Phoenix described it, like the front of the dystopia? Or if I believe in such a thing, am I putting the puppeteer, the literal embodiment of the society as a person who does in fact control all the aspects of it?
Something that a lot of dystopian stories deal with is, not all, but a lot of them deal with kind of the loss of identity, kind of individual versus the collective. So because of that, I think that you can almost get away with having your antagonists either be like just a character who is part of the machine, if you know what I mean, as having them be, there might be an individual who is repeatedly showing up as the antagonist, but if you have at some point the character become aware, if it wasn't this person, it would just be another person doing this role.
Yeah.
Or like with V for Vendetta, and I think Fahrenheit 9/11, I think, does the same thing, is that if the character was to step out, you realize it's just a society. It's not even a person. It's just the web work of the institutions and how they all function together. I think that does work within the themes of those stories as an antagonist, because it is often about the character trying to resist just becoming part of the machine. And for that same reason, I think that's why they're very popular YA novels, because they kind of talk a lot about trying to like define yourself apart from what's becoming a collective and what's becoming already homogenized and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's so true. It very, very closely echoes something that's very near to the sort of adolescent experience, is that like finding your own identity. Who am I in all of this stuff that's being demonstrated to me? And that's like a very strong element of a lot of. It almost shares that element of realizing that the focal point of the society is just like a figurehead or an ignorant person or whatever it is, and then suddenly you realize it's the society itself. It almost shares elements of like existential horror with that, in the sense that like there's this moment where suddenly it just opens up completely and the entire story reframes, and there's that dropping out of like, oh, we weren't even close to the solution. Like we were nowhere. We just discovered the problem, and it's massive.
Yeah. Like changing government or changing president isn't necessarily going to fix all of the problems. The problems still exist, regardless of who's in charge. Yeah.
It's a lot easier when you can just, blow up Sauron and peace returns to Middle Earth.
Immediately the army dissipates, and
not like another orc just steps in, like, like, now I'm Sauron, now I'm the Dark Lord.
Yeah, the Shire gets affordable health care. All
Frodo care. So how do you achieve an end game for a dystopian story that can be considered? What is a good end game? What are some end games that we liked? Because Never Let Me Go left me a shattered shell of a man for a few weeks.
I did not like Endgame, by the way. I just had to make that joke.
No worries. Go ahead.
Yeah, all right. But I actually didn't like it. That is true.
I think so. There's often, I guess, if the story is about rebellion, the answer is either that they do save the day and fix society, or they save the day and briefly fix society, but then either they become the new thing, or some element of their own rebellion ends up instituting the new.
Goes wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Star Wars What?
Star Wars, yeah. Animal Farm as well, a good one.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I quite like that as a. I think that's a great allegory because so many revolutions do take on that.
We need justice for Snowball. That was just wrong. What happened to that poor pig?
Not fair, yeah. Um, and apart from that, I think the other option is that things don't change and the characters remain in that world. I think that's quite a challenging ending to pull off, and I do think people often. I personally like it as an ending. Obviously, I like sad endings, but I think people are often kind of find it a bit unsatisfying when a dystopian story ends with the character not overcoming the kind of insurmountable odds that they're up against. And I've never read one where they've like found a way to like just live in a society. That tends to not go in line with those stories. I guess they could break the character and they become a part of the society, or else they're just stuck in that society forever. But yeah, they are challenging endings, I think.
That's true. Also, I do need to clarify. I realized I was just searching. It's not, I said I didn't like Endgame. That is a Marvel movie. I did love that movie. In my
Oh,
mind, it was the last one of the series of Hunger Games.
oh yes,
Ah,
yes,
I
yes.
thought it was Hunger
ah,
Games Endgame, but I was just combining
no.
Hunger Games with what it was.
They missed a trick there with that. Would have been a good end game.
But no, I didn't. At least I just saw the movies. I didn't like that last movie. They're, they're terrible.
I just feel like the thing that maybe intimidates me the most about writing dystopias is the thing that James loves about them, which is that the ending leaves you feeling like someone, open up your stomach. And many of them, not all of them, but at least many of those I read, I kind of often leading to the conclusion that we cannot fix the world sometimes. And either the character comes to terms with the dystopia or they find a small pocket in the dystopia in which they are allowed to have something of a peace, internal or external. And I think as a reader, I kind of struggle with it. I appreciate it for the skill it takes and for the like, but I do feel a little unsatisfied when nothing has improved.
I guess the lesson I take away from those endings is like, don't let it get to that point. Now that you've seen, now that you've seen what that society is, and
Hmm.
these are the roadmaps along the way, or the landmarks along the way. You have to
Yeah,
do something about it then, because by the time it's gotten here, it's too
it's
late.
too late.
Yeah, and all of those stories that I'm thinking of now that had like really bleak endings where the characters didn't get out of it, the characters are always reflecting on like, we should have done this, or we should have noticed this, or we should have stood up and said something beforehand.
Or
God,
mom and dad should have noticed this a couple
yes, yeah,
decades ago.
generations ago. Then, yeah, people in general should have stepped up and noticed something. And so I think that feeds back into what like Phoenix was saying about these ideas becoming part of the zeitgeist. It's that's the way of doing it, and that's the way of letting that happen.
I feel like well, two sort of elements come to mind when I think of ending a dystopian story is you have the actual obliteration or perpetuation of the society. You could kind of go, you have those sort of archetypes, but then you also have the spectrum of how the character feels in that. So like if the society perpetuates, but the character has discovered something and it ends with the character being very fired up, like that's still that's kind of a win,
Mm.
as opposed to ending with the character also feeling very they've had their own fire extinguished as well. Then it's like, oh well, dang. um yeah, you can explore a lot with just the filter of what the character's last experience of it is. I feel like did they discover love again in the midst of the perpetuation of this thing? And maybe even their focus isn't on trying to fix the thing anymore, but at the very least they've found something they can focus on. Like, I don't know, that's kind of a win for the human condition too. Is almost like, do they preserve it's not so much do they take down the thing. The win is like, do they preserve their individuality? Do they find themselves in the machine? And then as long as they do that, I feel like it's considered a win if they find a love connection or even just a corner where they can be them. Like if as long as they perpetuate as well, then it's kind of like, yes, they got it. But if they do just become a cog in it and feed it, then it's like, then that's where kind of it loses.
I don't know what I was expecting from a podcast episode about dystopia, but I guess it is depressing. But I just want to kind of put my thumb on why, when I watch or write a horror movie, when everybody ends in pieces on the floor, it doesn't affect me the same way as a dystopian society. And like maybe it's the supernatural element. Like deep down, I know that the Babadook is not gonna kill me, but my society might devolve into a tyrannical, murderous, kind of society where everybody eats each other. Maybe it's like James said, that it kind of feels like a roadmap for something that could happen, or is happening, or happened, that makes me so uncomfortable and sad compared to other quote unquote bad endings that don't get the same effect out of me specifically.
I think it's
Maybe
because so
others.
much of the story is about resistance and is about trying to maintain individuality or humanity. And yeah, like Phoenix was saying, like the human condition struggling against all of these bigger factors, and characters trying to find some amount of hope or some amount of love, is that when the characters lose on those terms, it's like such a total loss. It's not just that they died, it's that they lost all of those things and then had to continue living, and everyone had to continue living in this system. Whereas you can say, the monster got them, but maybe they didn't lose who they were. Maybe they didn't lose their humanity. Maybe they didn't lose that resistance to survive, or that one thing that they were fighting for. You could have a horror story where that did happen and it'd be really bleak. But it tends to not go to that such a degree. But yeah, like I think you can like to double down on what Phoenix was saying about characters finding their little corner, or kind of the human condition persevering despite everything. Like if you have like the story end with the characters maintaining that sense of hope, they might still have lost, but you could implement something into the story where like the seeds of the society's destruction are still present, and so there's still hope for revolution if the characters maintain hope and that seed of its own destruction is there. I remember the ending of Watchmen managed to do that quite well, where it wasn't really a dystopian story, but this big lie had happened involving the media, and the characters had all been stopped and they'd all decided to stay quiet. But the last scene is one character's journal being picked up by a newspaper person. So it ends on this note of, it may all come out and it may all be undone. So something like that at the end of a dystopian story can work quite well. And I think thematically, the idea of an oppressive society destroying itself and not maintaining its own control feels very believable, feels very realistic. The idea that if the characters can just hold out, the society itself will just crumble on its own accord.
I think, has anyone watched the Charlie Chaplin movie, 1941, The Dictator? It's one of the first movies. Yeah, it's one of the first movies he actually speak.
Yes.
And he actually, it's a movie basically imitating Hitler. He's a normal barber who gets switched out with the dictator of a Germany-like country during World War II because they look the same. They just happen to be identical in the way they look. And he's trying to give this speech to the masses to kind of dissuade them from this, saying, we don't need war. We don't. And instead, he just kind of finds that he has invigorated the flames of war, and they react completely in the opposite way to what he expected. And again, it's the system. And basically, you could have swapped out that person. You could have had him say, no, we don't want this, and the wheels are already turning towards something.
Yeah.
But he did say a line that really stuck with me, and he said, as long as tyrants die, liberty will exist. So basically, as long as people reach the natural end of their life, and dictatorships too, eventually, that kind of gives you hope that however bad this is, tyrants eventually die, and it's not going to last. nowadays, maybe you're starting to think that we're not far from the day where someone will not have to die if they can afford it. But that puts a whole new spin on the dictator thing.
That does, yeah.
Yeah.
People can upload themselves onto a computer and just everyone just keep the computer alive.
My point is that I like what Phoenix said about how the seed of hope in the darkness can kind of leave you feeling a bit bittersweet about the whole thing in a good way.
I have a fun little exercise because I started thinking about you mentioned horror and why that doesn't leave you feeling the same way. So I was trying to combine horror in my head. I was writing a little horror story combined with the dystopian fiction to see if I could find. But like, so if you had a horror movie where people were slowly being picked off and being killed and stuff, and then the protagonist is the only person that is aware of the monster and can see it and is actively trying, like, you know what, whatever, I'm going to be a monster hunter and I'm going to go after it. And then in the whole movie, they're struggling to get other people to believe them, to maybe even see the monster as well. And then at the very end, the protagonist is killed and it just fades back into everyone not being aware the monster is even there. And you know that it's just going to go on picking off people, blah, blah, blah. And I feel like
I immediately think of The Ring.
Is that The Ring?
Yeah,
I haven't
it's
seen
the one where it's very good.
Okay.
It's the one where it's really safe. If you watch a videotape and you see the image of the videotape, you'll die in 7 days.
Yes.
Okay. I never knew the premise of The Ring.
I think you should check it out because it's good.
It's canonical, seriously.
Yeah,
as far as horror movies go.
Okay.
I think it's probably based on a Japanese horror originally, which in itself I think is based on like kind of Japanese folklore. But yeah, the Ring is very good. That's a really good horror.
I like The Ring, and I like Phoenix's idea because it really the helplessness is kind of dystopian, I suppose, in which he's trying to do something and just doesn't work out, and in the end, again, hopelessness in which the monster basically is just going to keep doing that, and there's no one who can. But like, if you wanted to finish on a bittersweet tone, you can have like the after credit scene of a little boy like seeing something in the corner of his eye. And like, ooh, there's another. It's something like that.
And I kind of landed for myself. I'm like, I mean, like, it has similar elements. It doesn't carry the same impact because I feel like at the end of the day, it's too much of an abstraction. Like you've pulled too far you've created too much of an analogy, so it doesn't carry the same like, we're just like, it just makes you go, we're talking about monsters. This would never happen.
Yeah.
But
you
could take any existing dystopia and turn it into a horror version of itself. Just by highlighting certain elements.
Yeah. Even structuring certain downfalls and failures of the character could turn it from a tragedy into a horror very quickly. Call of Cthulhu feels like a supernatural dystopian thing.
True.
Where like the characters have discovered something but no one's taking them seriously and there's this other thing going on. But then because it's all buried in the supernatural and larger monsters, it just doesn't have that same realism to it.
Yeah. If I could go back in time, I would go to Lovecraft's house and just give the guy a hug. maybe take him to church. I don't know, something.
And you would be the one responsible for killing all his amazing work because you destroyed his muse by being kind to him.
You would have,
no, I'm kidding.
There would be no Stephen King. There would be no Dan Simmons.
You would have a version of Cthulhu that is like a Pokemon. He would befriend humans. Yeah, just imagine it. He would be voiced by Danny DeVito, and he would be like your friend. Cthulhu's here for you. Everybody needs a Cthulhu in their life.
Yeah.
We're not losing anything, Phoenix. We're getting something better.
You're right. Cthulhu comes in and instead of like psyching you out, like, existentially destroying you, he's just like, you gotta wake up. Wake up.
You gotta wake up, buddy.
Look around.
Look around.
You gotta get out.
Tell her how you feel. Like he uses telepathy to give you. You take her on a boat ride.
It's just like, you're doing great. You're doing great. Don't worry about it.
I love that.
Look at me.
I took it as a very like existentially wake up thing, like wake up. And I love that you went to like it's 5 a.m. Wake up, and he's just like your accountability buddy.
Yeah,
Just like, you got to
That's
go for a
great.
jog, man. Let's go.
I would like to pull back from my jab at H.P. Lovecraft because I am a firm believer that you do not need to be suffering to write good stuff. So don't take that like just to
Yeah.
clarifying.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, but is it likely that you were suffering if you wrote that stuff? That's if we're talking statistics.
I don't think you need to be unhappy to write good stuff. I think he wrote good stuff because he was unhappy. But I don't think that the two go hand in hand. Yeah.
Big distinction.
Not a requirement, but
Yes. Yeah.
an indicator sometimes.
Yeah.
Not every rectangle is a square.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
All right. On that note, I think we might call it.
I have a quote for us for today. The quote is a little more positive, maybe, and it is attributed as an Italian proverb. So if it is actually something someone specific said, I apologize. I found it as an Italian proverb, and it says, "Hope is the last thing ever lost," which plays into what we said about how maybe in a horror movie there's damage to your body, but in a good dystopia, what is really at risk of being taken away is the will to resist, the belief that resistance is even plausible.
I'm actually I'm gonna pop in here with another quote also, just because it's like I feel like it also just summarizes very well why we like dystopian fiction. It's by Ali Kandi, and it's the beauty of dystopia is that it lets us vicariously experience future worlds, but we still have the power to change our own. And that's, I feel, that really hits it. Thank you,
That's
Ali.
great.
I'm gonna pop in one as well, and this one's from
Oh,
Let's go.
So George Orwell's quote is, "Power worship blurs political judgment because it leads almost unavoidably to the belief that present trends will continue. Whoever is winning at the moment will always seem to be invincible."
wow, George.
Yeah.
Very,
It's some positive notes too.
had some things to say.
Is it? Nice.
Also, at this point, you've made it all the way to the end of this podcast. I'm assuming you've enjoyed it to some extent if you're here. So if you are listening and you like this podcast, give it a rating, give it a review. You can reach out to us, say hello. We'd love that. But yeah, that really helps us. It helps people find it. We do like the idea of creating a bit of a, virtual community here of people that just like talking about this stuff. So if you know someone that you think might enjoy this, pass this along because it's fun to listen to other people talk about things that you also like talking about. And then also we have an anthology out. It's been out for a year, more than a year now. The New Mythic. Feel free to obviously feel free. You're free to do whatever you want, but I recommend you grab a copy on Amazon, or I think that might be we're digitally Amazon. And if you like that as well, give that a review if you've already read it. But it's a collection of short stories. Really, it's a collection of novellas. They're all pretty beefy little buggers. But yeah, good mix of sci-fi, fantasy, horror. All of the Precipites are in there. It's been nominated for a couple of awards. Yeah, give it a try if you like that stuff. I'm sure you'll find something in there for you. As well as if you don't feel like reading the words off the page, you can listen to the words in your ears because it is an audiobook. You can find it on Audible, and I'm gonna stop listing at Audible because there are a lot of them and I don't know many more of them, but you can find it, listen to it. You can also review it. Some amazing voice talent on that one. And yeah, that's about it. Does anybody have anything else? Is there anything else?
No, thank you. Thank you guys for depressing me on this beautiful Saturday. Can I request that the next episode will be about children's stories or something like that? Or marshmallows?
Yeah, we're gonna bring On a very special episode of Precipice Fiction, we're just going to talk about marshmallows
Talk
today.
marshmallows for an hour. Yeah, we can do that.
I think there's a need for it in today's world. Just, we each bring our own marshmallow brand and enjoy them.
Wow. That's something. Yeah, I like it.
We're thinking about
Right.
Thanks very much, listeners. I hope this has been a fun and interesting listen and not too depressing. And if you're not reading dystopian stuff, definitely check it out. And if you're not writing dystopian stuff, definitely give it a go. It's an interesting way of exploring, just exploring different kinds of themes of love and hope and human perseverance and rebellion, identity, and everything like that. So thanks very much, listeners, and take care.
Bye.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.